First of all, thank you all for helping this channel grow. We truly appreciate the support. Making these documentaries isn't easy. We do weeks, sometimes months of research. None of the narrator lines is copied from any website. All the lines were written by us. Thank you.
You're watching the David Ruffin Story. Sit back and relax. David Eli Ruffin, born on January 18, 1941 in Wyanett, Mississippi. His mother, Ophelia Ruffin, died when David was only 11 months old. David's father, Elias Ruffin, was a Baptist minister. He was very strict and at times abusive. David, along with his siblings Quincy, Rhea May, and Jimmy, all grew up in church. As a child, David, along with his siblings, traveled with their father and their stepmother as a family gospel group. They opened shows for Mahalia Jackson and the Five Blind Boys of Mississippi, and others. David later began singing in the choir at Mount Salem Methodist Church. Around 1955, a 14-year-old David left home under the guardianship of a minister by the name of Eddie Bush and went to Memphis, Tennessee. A year later, David went to Hot Springs, Arkansas with the jazz musician Phineas Newborn Sr. and played at the 50 Grand Ballroom and Casino. David began going by the stage name Little David Bush and continued singing in talent shows. He would later become a member of the Dixie Nightingales and even sang with the Soul Stirrers. As a teenager, David met later popular musicians such as Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Frankie Lemon, Bobby Womack, the Staple Singers, and more. A few of David's singing idols had left gospel music and gone secular. David decided to do the same. When David was 16 years old, Eddie Bush and his wife took David to Detroit, Michigan, where his older brother Jimmy was already pursuing a career in music and working at the Ford Motor Company. David would eventually meet Berry Gordy Jr. David temporarily lived with Gordy's father, who was a contractor, and built the Hitsville, USA building. Gordy started Tamla Records and used the building as its headquarters. Jimmy Ruffin later signed to the label. In 1958, David recorded his first release record with the songs You and I and Believe Me under Vega Records. David later signed with Anna Records, began recording with the Voice Masters. He later signed as a solo artist, but the songs didn't do well. In 1961, David married his first wife, Sandra Barnes. The two had 3 daughters together. Times was hard for 20-year-old David. His music career wasn't looking good. He still had to work regular jobs to feed his family. The Temptations were struggling at the time as well. You're My Dream Come True in 1962 was the group's biggest song at the time. After the failure of I Want the Love I Can See, led by Paul Williams, the Temptation were really in need of a hit. Group member Elbridge Bryant began getting drunk and causing problems in the group. He even allegedly struck Paul across the face with a glass bottle once. Bryant's negative energy was destroying the group. In 1962, Jimmy Ruffin was drafted for national service. He returned in 1964 and continued working for Motown. He went on a Motown review tour with the Temptations and was offered the opportunity to join the group, replacing Elbridge Bryant. But after hearing his younger brother David sing, the Temptations decided to give the job to David instead. David's voice was special. Not only could he sing, David could dance as well, unlike his brother Jimmy. David became a member of the Temptations, and the group recorded The Way You Do the Things You Do, led by Eddie Kendricks. This became the Temptations' first top 20 hit. The group's first album, Meet the Temptations, was released in 1964. Most of the songs on the album were recorded before David joined the group. In the fall of 1964, David recorded his first lead vocal for the group, My Girl, written by Smokey Robinson. My Girl was released as a single, and it became the Temptations' first #1 pop hit. My Girl is now considered one of the greatest songs ever. In 2004, the song was ranked number 88 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. David's vocals sounded so good it seemed unreal to listeners at the time. My Girl is the group's signature song to this day. David met a young lady by the name of Jenna around this time. She didn't know that David was married with children. The two began living together and would later have a son. In 1965, David sang lead on the next 3 singles, It's Growing, Since I Lost My Baby, and My Baby, which were all top 20 hits. David was very humble in the beginning. He was always on time for rehearsals and kept a positive attitude. Otis and the other Temptation members loved working with David in the beginning. In 1966, a young songwriter and producer by the name Norman Whitfield was ready to work with the Temptations. Gordy told Norman if the group's single, Get Ready, failed to chart in the top 20, he had the green light to produce the next single. Get Ready, written by Smokey Robinson, didn't chart in the top 20, so Norman and the Temptations recorded Ain't Too Proud to Beg. David's voice on the song gave people chills. Ain't Too Proud to Beg peaked at number 13 on the Billboard Pop Chart and was a #1 hit on the Billboard charts for 8 weeks. Norman gave the Temptations a new sound. Every single he produced for the Temptations in the beginning were led by David Ruffin and were all hits as well. Songs such as Beauty Is Only Skin Deep, I Know I'm Losing You, All I Need, You're My Everything, and Wish It Would Rain. The Temptations was now one of the biggest singing groups in the world. David's voice on Wish It Would Rain made grown men cry. His voice was so powerful on the song, it sounded like a god was singing. Beauty Only Skin Deep was another magical song led by David Ruffin. His powerful vocals gave people a joyful feeling. David had more charisma than any artist on Motown. He was known for dropping to his knees and doing splits. Women have passed out and even had orgasms hearing and watching David perform. David Ruffin continued sleeping with different women. He was now at the top of the food chain. Females all ages wanted to sleep with David. David began dating Tammy Terrell. Tammy Terrell was a star singer for Motown Records, notably for a series of duets with singer Marvin Gaye, such as Ain't No Mountain High Enough, You're Precious Love, If I Could Build My Whole World Around You, and If This World Was Mine. David began cheating on Gina and eventually leave her for Tammy. David and Tammy quickly fell in love and moved into an apartment together. They were planning to get married, but just like Gina, Tammy learned that David was already married with kids. David was a jealous and abusive man. He began beating on Tammy and even allegedly beating her in the head with his motorcycle helmet. Their relationship didn't last long. David was living like a rock star. He hung out with drug dealers, hookers, and pimps. David also began abusing cocaine around this time. It quickly became his drug of choice. He began bringing his dealer with him on tours. David loved hanging out in the streets. He even carried around guns for protection. Didn't many people know about his wife, Sandra, who he married in 1961 and had 3 daughters with? David was fighting a lot of demons. He tried to hide his pain by using drugs and alcohol. A 27-year-old David Ruffin was very confused. David began thinking that he was responsible for the group's success. He became very cocky and hard to work with. David began drinking a lot and using drugs. In the late 60s, LSD was becoming popular in black communities. David was becoming a party animal. He began showing up late for rehearsals and even shows. This was a new David Ruffin. He stopped riding with the rest of the group when they went on tours. David rode in back of a black limo with mink floors along with Tammy Terrell. A logo of his eyeglasses was printed on the side of the limo so fans knew it was him. After the Supremes changed their name to Diana Ross and the Supremes, David wanted the Temptations to be renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations. Otis and other members were getting frustrated with David's behavior. David's right-hand man Eddie Kendricks loved hanging out with him. The two partied together often. In 1968, David began dating Dean Martin's daughter. He missed a show to attend one of her events. He was then voted out the group and replaced with Dennis Edwards. David didn't really want to go solo. He loved working with the Temptations. He even made a few attempts to rejoin the group. But Otis and the guys were now ready to work with Dennis. Dennis was once a gospel singer like David, and they both had powerful voices. David knew that Dennis was going to be his replacement before Dennis had any idea. Dennis was signed to Motown, but placed on retainer after leaving the group The Contours in '67. According to Otis, Dennis was much easier to work with. In October 1968, Ruffin filed suit against Motown Records, seeking a release from the label and an accounting of his money. Motown countersued to keep the singer from leaving the label, and eventually the case was settled. David began popping up at the Temptations shows. He would hop on stage and steal the microphone from Dennis when the group performed songs that David sang lead on. The crowd went wild each time. Otis and other Temptation members even began having conversations about bringing David back in the group. But David continued being David. In 1969, David released his first solo hit, titled My Whole World Ended. The song reached the US Pop and R&B Top 10. The song was originally written for the Temptations, but Gordy decided to give the song to David. My Whole World Ended album peaked at 31 on the US Billboard and #1 on the US Billboard albums. David Ruffin was back. He even began touring with the Temptations. David released another album in '69 titled Feeling Good. His third album, titled David, was shelved by Motown. In 1970, David and his brother Jimmy released an album together titled I Am My Brother's Keeper. And in 1973, the album David Ruffin was released. My Whole World Ended was David's only major hit at the time. His music career wasn't looking good. David and Eddie Kendricks remained close friends. In 1971, Kendricks left the Temptations influenced by David. Plus, Kendrick didn't like the group's new sound. He preferred Smokey Robinson-written love ballads. In 1975, David came back stronger than ever when he released Walk Away From Love. The single was #1 on the US R&B singles chart and even crossed over to #9 on the pop charts. In Canada, the single peaked number 30, selling over 1 million copies. David Ruffin was back on top. In 1976, he married Joy Hamilton, but months later they divorced. David left Motown in 1977 and signed with Warner Brothers. He released 2 albums with Warner Brothers and later signed with MCA Records. In the 80s, David became addicted to crack cocaine. In 1982, he served 4 months in prison for failing to pay taxes. David allegedly began dealing crack cocaine. He was arrested after a raid at a Detroit crack house in the summer of '87. He was charged with cocaine possession with intent to distribute. In 1989, David Ruffin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the Temptations. Shortly after, David, along with Eddie Kendrick and Dennis Edwards, began touring and recording as Ruffin Kendrick Edwards, former lead of the Temptations. In 1991, the trio completed a successful month-long tour of England, which grossed a lot of money. After returning from the tour, David decided to go and celebrate at a nearby crack house instead of going home first. At the time, David was living in Philadelphia with his girlfriend Diane Showers. David allegedly had a money belt containing $40,000 from the England tour on him at the time. David and a man named Donald had allegedly went to visit a guy named William in West Philadelphia. Donald was allegedly David's driver, and William was David's runner. David would often go over to William's place to score crack cocaine. William was a middleman who knew drug dealers in West Philly. Not only did William score crack for David, he provided David a place to hang out and use the crack as well. William's place was the hangout spot for users, dealers, and even prostitutes. David and William had allegedly split 10 vials of crack cocaine at William's house. David allegedly collapsed inside the West Philadelphia house. David was taken to the hospital by a limousine and was escorted to the waiting area by his driver. David Ruffin was later pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. Ruffin's funeral was held at New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. Michael Jackson offered to pay for the funeral but decided not to attend. People such as Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, and even the Temptations all sang at David's funeral. Could no one sing like David Ruffin, said Martha Reeves. David's voice came from his soul. Some say listening to David Ruffin sing is like listening to a ghost. His voice describes how all men feel when their heart's broken. Marvin Gaye once said Ruffin's voice made him remember that when women listen to music, they want to feel the power of a real man. Daryl Hall once said, David's voice had a certain glorious anguish that spoke to people on many emotional levels. David himself said, he don't know what kind of voice he have. He said it's just about the feeling he get for the song. Rod Stewart said David's voice on I Wish It Would Rain jumped out of the speakers and ravished his soul. David Ruffin is now a legend. His music will live forever. Well, that was the David Ruffin story. Thank you all for watching. See you next time.